Lieutenant John Ringler stood at the open doorway of the lead C-47, the cold wind whipping against his face as he scanned the darkened landscape below. The roaring engines of the plane drowned out all other sounds, but in his mind, the silence was deafening. Below him, white smoke billowed up from the ground, the signal they had been waiting for. The drop zone was marked, and the raid was about to begin. The weight of his gear pressed down on him, but it was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. This was it. The lives of over 2,000 prisoners, half-starved and brutalized by their Japanese captors, hinged on the next few minutes. If they failed, those prisoners would be slaughtered before help could reach them. Ringler knew the odds, knew the dangers that awaited them on the ground, but there was no turning back now. He glanced back at his men, their faces tense, eyes locked on him, waiting for the command. Ringler shouted, quote, "Let's go!" His voice barely audible over the deafening roar. With one final breath, he leaped into the void, the darkness swallowing him whole. The shadow of war fell swiftly over the Philippines in 1941. As Japanese forces swept across the islands, the once tranquil archipelago was transformed into a brutal battleground. The fall of Bataan and Corregidor marked the collapse of Allied defenses, leading to the capture of tens of thousands of US and Filipino soldiers and civilians. These men and women were herded into overcrowded prison camps where the conditions were unspeakable. Starvation, disease, and daily brutality became the norm. Among these camps was Los Baños, a facility that would later become the focal point of one of World War II's most daring rescue missions. In the midst of this chaos, General Douglas MacArthur, a pivotal figure in the Pacific Theater, was forced to make a harrowing decision. Ordered by President Roosevelt to escape to Australia, MacArthur reluctantly left the Philippines in March 1942, leaving behind his men, his comrades, and his promise to return. He vowed, quote, "I shall return." These words would become a rallying cry for the Allied forces and a beacon of hope for those suffering under Japanese occupation. MacArthur's connection to the Philippines was more than strategic, it was deeply personal. Having spent much of his career in the islands, he considered the Philippines a second home. This personal connection only deepened his resolve to liberate the islands and rescue the thousands of prisoners languishing in the camps. Intelligence reports in late 1944 and early 1945 painted a grim picture. Conditions in the camps were deteriorating rapidly, and the Japanese were becoming increasingly brutal as they sensed the tide of war turning against them. The situation at Los Baños was particularly dire, with over 2,000 prisoners, many of them American civilians, including women and children, facing imminent execution if not rescued soon. Gruesome incidents, such as the December 1944 massacre at the Puerto Princesa prison camp, convinced MacArthur of the urgent need to save as many prisoners of war as possible before the Japanese eliminated them while being pushed back by American soldiers. Consequently, American and Filipino guerrillas resolved to organize and launch a series of daring rescue operations to free the remaining POWs before they were lost forever. MacArthur knew that time was of the essence. The Allied forces, having fought their way through the South Pacific in a grueling island-hopping campaign, were finally poised to reclaim the Philippines. But even as his troops fought their way toward Manila, MacArthur made it clear that the rescue of the prisoners was a top priority. He later reflected, quote, "There was no fixed timetable to reconquer Luzon. I hope to proceed as rapidly as possible, especially as time was an element connected with the release of our prisoners." MacArthur turned to Major General Joseph Swing, the commander of the 11th Airborne Division, to carry out this mission. Swing, a seasoned and strategic leader, was tasked with planning the rescue operation. The mission would be complicated, requiring precise coordination and the element of surprise. Los Baños was located deep behind enemy lines, 25 miles south of Manila on the southern shore of Laguna de Bay, a massive inland lake that added to the logistical challenges. With the stakes so high, every decision weighed heavily. MacArthur's resolve was unwavering, driven by both strategic necessity and a personal sense of duty to the people he had left behind. The success of the mission would depend on the meticulous planning and execution by Swing's division and the courage of the men who would soon find themselves dropping into the heart of enemy territory to save those who had been abandoned to the horrors of war. The Los Baños raid, one of the most audacious rescue missions of World War II, was born out of necessity and executed with unparalleled precision. The task was daunting: to infiltrate a heavily guarded enemy camp deep behind Japanese lines, liberate over 2,000 prisoners, and escape before reinforcements could react. The success of this mission hinged on meticulous planning, daring reconnaissance, and the unwavering resolve of a few key figures. Three men at the heart of the planning effort were Lieutenant Colonel Henry J. Muller, Colonel Douglas P. Quant, and Major J. D. Vanderpool. Each brought a unique set of skills to the table, and together they formed the backbone of the operation's strategic planning. Muller, the division's G2 intelligence officer, was tasked with gathering crucial information about the camp and its defenses. Quant, the G3 operations officer, was responsible for developing the detailed plan of attack. Vanderpool, a seasoned guerrilla warfare expert, provided invaluable knowledge of the local terrain and the movements of enemy forces. Intelligence was key to the operation's success. Muller's team utilized every available resource, including aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and reports from Filipino guerrillas who had been fighting a covert war against the Japanese for years. The guerrillas, familiar with the region, were able to provide detailed information on the camp's layout, guard routines, and possible weak points. Their reports revealed that Los Baños was surrounded by two barbed wire fences, each 6 feet tall, with guard towers and pillboxes strategically placed around the perimeter. The Japanese defenders were well armed and vigilant, making any frontal assault highly risky. One of the most critical pieces of intelligence came from an unlikely source. An escaped prisoner named Peter Miles had managed to slip out of the camp under cover of darkness in a desperate attempt to get any semblance of food for his starving prison mates. During his escape through the jungle, he made contact with Filipino guerrillas who, knowing the information inside this man's head was invaluable, immediately arranged a meeting between him and Muller. Miles provided a detailed description of the camp's interior, including the daily routines of the guards and prisoners. His insights were pivotal in shaping the final plan, offering the planners a rare glimpse into the life inside Los Baños and the best times to strike. Even with this wealth of information, the operation was fraught with challenges. Major General Joseph Swing, the commander of the 11th Airborne Division, initially had to delay the raid due to the intense fighting in Manila. The delay, while frustrating, allowed for further refinement of the plan. The operation was eventually broken down into 4 distinct phases: infiltration, parachute drop, amphibious assault, and a diversionary attack. The first phase involved Lieutenant George Scow's reconnaissance platoon and nearly 80 Filipino guerrillas crossing Laguna de Bay in small native boats known as bancas. They would secure the drop zone and neutralize key enemy positions before the main force arrived. The second phase was the parachute drop, led by Lieutenant John Ringler's B Company. Their task was to land within the camp's vicinity, storm the compound, and neutralize the guards. The third phase involved 59 amphibious vehicles known as Amtraks, which would transport reinforcements and evacuate the prisoners. The final phase was a diversionary attack by the 1st Battalion, 188th Glider Infantry, designed to draw Japanese forces away from the camp and prevent reinforcements from interfering with the rescue. Throughout the planning process, the enormity of the task weighed heavily on the minds of those involved. Major Henry Burgess, who would lead the main assault, voiced his concerns. Quote, "How could my force of 412 paratroopers slip undetected deep into Japanese-controlled territory, wipe out a large number of enemy guards at the camp, and bring back to safety 2,200 weak men, women, and children, many of whom were unable to walk?" The complexity of the mission was staggering. The camp's location, deep in enemy territory and surrounded by treacherous terrain, presented immense logistical challenges. Yet, despite these obstacles, the planners pressed on, knowing that the lives of thousands depended on their success. The night before the raid was thick with tension and anticipation. Lieutenant George Scow, accompanied by Lieutenant Haggerty, set out on one final reconnaissance mission, determined to ensure that every aspect of the plan was airtight. Under the cover of darkness, they crossed the treacherous waters of Laguna de Bay in Bancas. Upon reaching the shores near Los Baños, they met with two escaped prisoners, Ben Edwards and Freddy Zavulakos, who provided last-minute intelligence about the camp's defenses and the movements of the Japanese guards. With this vital information, Scow and Haggerty made the final adjustments to the plan, refining the assault's timing and the positioning of their men. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Scow led his reconnaissance platoon and nearly 80 Filipino guerrillas into position around Los Baños. The men moved silently through the jungle, their senses heightened by the knowledge of what was at stake. Scow's orders were clear and precise. Quote, "Hold your fire until you see the first parachute." The success of the raid depended on perfect timing and the element of surprise. At precisely 4 a.m., the paratroopers began boarding the 59 amphibious vehicles, or Amtraks, that would carry them across the lake to the shores near the camp. The vehicles, cumbersome and slow, churned through the water in near-total darkness, guided only by handheld compasses and the faintest of moonlight. At the same time, miles away at Nichols Field, Lieutenant John Ringler and his B Company were making their final checks before takeoff. The paratroopers double-checked their gear, adjusted their parachutes, and steeled themselves for what lay ahead. By 6 a.m., the 9 C-47s roared to life, lifting off into the dawn sky and heading toward the drop zone. The flight was short but seemed to stretch on forever, as every man was lost in their thoughts. At 6:58 a.m., right on schedule, white smoke began to rise from the designated drop zone, Scow's signal that the time had come. Ringler, standing at the open door of the lead C-47, gave the order to jump. One by one, the paratroopers hurled themselves into the void, their parachutes snapping open in the cool morning air. The descent was a blur of adrenaline and fear. As they neared the ground, the crack of gunfire erupted from below. Scow's men, having held their fire until the last possible moment, now unleashed a ferocious barrage on the Japanese guards. The perimeter of the camp was soon a battlefield, with the paratroopers landing amidst the chaos. Ringler's men, as they hit the ground, quickly shed their parachutes and joined the fight, their rifles blazing as they pushed toward the camp's fences. For 15 intense minutes, the battle raged around the compound. The Japanese defenders were caught off guard and fought desperately, but were overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the assault. Scao's reconnaissance platoon and the Filipino guerrillas had already taken out several guard towers and pillboxes, clearing the way for the main force. By 7:15 a.m., the camp's defenses were crumbling and the gates were breached. The first wave of paratroopers surged inside, securing the perimeter and preparing for the next phase of the operation, the evacuation of the prisoners. The raid was far from over, but the first, most critical objective had been achieved. The first sight of the parachutes descending from the clouds was incredible for the prisoners at Los Baños, a moment when hope, long buried beneath the weight of despair, suddenly roared back to life. James Bateman, a 20-year-old inmate, watched in awe as the paratroopers descended from the heavens. Quote, "The parachutes rained out of the sky. We yelled and screamed and danced with joy." For months, the prisoners had feared they would never leave the hellish camp, but now, salvation had arrived in the form of these airborne warriors. Inside the camp, the reaction among the prisoners was a mixture of euphoria and disbelief. They had lived under the shadow of doom for so long that the sudden appearance of their rescuers felt almost surreal. Cries of joy and relief echoed across the compound as the prisoners realized that their ordeal was finally coming to an end. One of the prisoners exclaimed, quote, "Thank God for the paratroopers. These are the angels he sent to save us." While the battle raged around them, Major Henry Burgess was already focused on the next critical phase of the operation, the evacuation. As the Japanese defenders were pushed back, the sound of rumbling engines announced the arrival of the amphibious force. Large and ungainly but vital for the extraction, the Amtraks came crashing through the camp's gates, their steel hulls gleaming in the morning sun. Burgess knew that time was of the essence. The Japanese were sure to launch a counterattack once they regrouped, and every second counted. The scene that followed was one of organized chaos. Prisoners, weakened by months of starvation and abuse, struggled to gather what little belongings they had. The paratroopers, aware of the ticking clock, did their best to maintain order, guiding the prisoners toward the waiting Amtraks. Some of the most weakened prisoners had to be carried out by the soldiers, their emaciated bodies too frail to walk. The Amtraks quickly filled up with their precious cargo, but it was clear that multiple trips would be necessary to evacuate everyone. The tension was palpable as the first wave of Amtraks began to pull away from the camp. Burgess, overseeing the operation, was acutely aware of the reports coming in from his scouts. Japanese forces were already on the move, and the window for a safe escape was rapidly closing. But there was a problem. They couldn't get to all of the prisoners as many were in hiding, too afraid to come out in the middle of a firefight. Burgess ordered Ringler to set fire to the remaining barracks, hoping the smoke and flames would spur the prisoners to move faster. It was very effective. The threat of the spreading fire drove the last of the prisoners into the open, where they were quickly loaded onto the remaining Amtraks. By 10 a.m., the first load of evacuees had reached the shores of Laguna de Bay, where they were transferred to boats for the final leg of their journey to safety. Back at the camp, however, the situation was growing increasingly dire. Reports of advancing Japanese forces had everyone on edge, and the final group of prisoners, along with the remaining paratroopers, braced themselves for a possible last stand. As the last few Amtraks loaded up, the Japanese launched a desperate but ultimately ineffective assault on the retreating forces. A few mortar rounds landed dangerously close, and sporadic gunfire kept everyone on high alert. But with the overwhelming preparation and effectiveness of the paratroopers, casualties were minimal. only one paratrooper and one former prisoner sustained minor injuries during the evacuation. By the time the final Amtrak rumbled away from the camp, Los Baños was a scene of destruction, the Japanese garrison decimated, and the prisoners were gone. In less than 3 hours, over 2,000 men, women and children had been rescued. The raid had been a resounding success, a testament to the bravery and skill of the 11th Airborne Division and their Filipino allies. The Los Baños raid stands as one of the most successful and daring rescue operations of World War II. In just a few hours, the 11th Airborne Division, alongside Filipino guerrillas, executed a near-flawless mission that saved over 2,000 lives without a single casualty among the prisoners or attackers. This extraordinary feat was a testament to meticulous planning, seamless coordination, and the unyielding courage of the soldiers who risked everything to save others from the horrors of war. The legacy of the 11th Airborne Division extends far beyond the immediate impact of the raid. The tactics they employed, combining airborne assaults, amphibious landings, and guerrilla warfare, have continued to influence modern special operations. Their ability to strike deep behind enemy lines, adapt to rapidly changing conditions, and achieve their objectives with precision remains a blueprint for successful military operations today. But beyond the strategic success lies a deeper, more human story. The Los Baños raid was not just a military triumph, but an affirmation of humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. It showcased the heroism of those who, even in the darkest of times, chose to stand against oppression and fight for the lives of others. For those rescued, the soldiers who leaped into the unknown that morning were more than fighters. They were angels of mercy, delivering hope to the hopeless.